Hello, everybody, and welcome back to SciByte, where we may not always get the answers to the universe correctly, but at least we walk away with some very interesting questions. Now, my name is Jeremy, and joining me, as always, on Skype is my lovely and talented geeky co-host, Heather.
Hi, guys. So this week, we're going to be looking at alternative fuel choices, where they come from, what some interesting facts about them, and even some of the chemistry involved.
Yeah, so not talking about physics this week for a change of pace. We're going to be talking, as you mentioned, chemistry and a little bit of biology. Now, I'll just come out and tell you guys, this is not really either of our areas of expertise, but hopefully between the two of us, we managed to gather enough intro to fuel the conversation.
There's our pun.
There it is.
All right, now one thing to note is that we're not going to be focusing on the politics, climate change, any polarizing subjects like that. We're just focusing on the science of this stuff.
That's right. All this other stuff, sociological, economical, all that kind of stuff, it's way above our pay grade. We're in this for the science, people.
Yep.
It's all about the science. And one more quick disclaimer is that a lot of tonight's show is going to be talking about primarily internal combustion engines, cars, industrial equipment, stuff like that uses currently fossil fuels. That's kind of where our focus on this alternative fuel subject is going to go. So I figured before we get into talking about the actual fuels themselves, we should give a little bit of a conversational explanation on some of the terminology we might end up using through tonight's show. Actually, one thing that stuck out to me is while we started doing some research on this, you had some great notes in here about ethanol, fuel sources later on, but you were using terminology that I didn't actually fully understand, like high octane. Now, I had to do some research on this ahead of time to actually understand what this is. I've always known that bigger numbers are better. You know, when you look at the pump, that's why they're more expensive, right? Yeah. I sure hope so. But what that actually means is that the higher octane concentration in these fuels, those higher end fuels, actually prevents them from pre-igniting, they call it, where the heat and the pressure within the cylinder of the engine might spark itself before the spark plug has a chance to control the combustion of that. So, which actually means that's why it's a higher grade of fuel. You don't risk getting a pre-ignition, which they call it, which can lead to bad timing in your engine. And the other term that I came across is the compression ratio. Heather, do you feel comfortable explaining this one for me?
Sure. Compression ratio is the ratio of the volume of the combustion chamber from its largest capacity to its smallest capacity. And that increases thermal efficiency. So a high compression ratio would give you more power per piston stroke.
So I mentioned earlier ethanol, and the reason that this all came up is that ethanol fuel has a very high octane rating by default, just because of its chemistry, its molecular structure. Now, ethanol is a form of biofuel, which is going to be one of the primary topics that we're talking about on today's show. Biofuel is an interesting thing because it actually is, well, it's more or less a natural occurrence. It's something that happens without a whole lot of interference from humans, although we can force it to happen as well.
Yes. So biofuels are, they cover a wide range of biologically produced alcohols, most commonly ethanol. You can also have propanol, butanol. People might have heard of these things. They're produced by microorganisms and enzymes and fermentation of starches and sugars, or cellulose, which is a little bit harder.
I think we'll get into that a little bit more. We're going to be talking a little more about cellulose biofuel a little later on. But just on a very basic level, maybe we should cover exactly how a plant or another biomass of some sort actually becomes fuel. It's not magic, people. No. We've got science to tell you.
Science. So we all remember photosynthesis from school, where you have carbon dioxide, water, and light, and they come together in a plant, and you can get out oxygen, but it also produces glucose, a type of sugar. So then we can take that glucose and ferment it. So from there you get ethanol, carbon dioxide, and heat. So then you can take the ethanol and oxygen in a combustion engine, combine them to get carbon dioxide, water, and heat. And the heat from that will actually
that's what produces things like the combustion in an internal combustion engines, and that's so that's the final product of this. But I gotta just sidebar here for just a minute. You've mentioned sugar, which made me a little hungry, and then you mentioned alcohol. If I recall correctly, isn't ethanol alcohol basically the same thing that is in everybody's favorite beer and whiskey and vodka and whatever your drink of choice would be?
Yeah, it is the same basic type of alcohol found in beverages that you buy at a bar.
But we're really only talking at a molecular level. This isn't the kind of thing where you can take a fifth of whiskey and pour it into your gas tank and it's going to get you down the road. So you're learning, people. This is science. We're teaching you.
Now, Brazil and the United States are already responsible for about 88% of the world's ethanol fuel production, at least in 2010. Yeah, in 2010. Most cars on the road today, at least in the U.S., could run a blend of up to 10% ethanol. And since 1976, the Brazilian government has made it mandatory to blend ethanol with gasoline. So these ethanol blends, at least to a small degree, are already on the road. And in some countries are mandatory to a certain amount.
Heavily in Brazil.
Yes.
Specifically, it says in our show notes here that Brazil uses a blend that's up to 25% ethanol. Ethanol, sorry. I'm going to mispronounce that a dozen more times. Please don't yell at me for it.
Nope, I'm just going to roll with it.
Now, ethanol, I'm actually honestly a little surprised by this because ethanol doesn't provide quite as much energy through burning it as gas does. In other words, it sounds to me like adding it to your gasoline actually makes your car run slightly less efficient, at least on the surface of it. The point here, though, is that ethanol tends to be more easily produced without harsh side effects on the climate and blah, blah, blah. I said we weren't going to go into all that. But also the fact that it produces less pollutants, emissions.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is it does have, like you were mentioning before, it does have a higher octane rating.
Now, is the octane rating, do you know, is it high enough to make up for the fact that it's a lower energy yield? Can you basically design an engine that even though you get less energy from it, you can get more piston power?
There is research going on about this. There are lots of companies that are researching, can we tune an engine to make it happier at certain specific blends for ethanol or other fuels? Can it look and see exactly what it has in it so that it can tune its efficiency specifically for the type of fuel in your car? Can you have a car that's tuned for a specific fuel? So there's ongoing research about that going on right now.
Now, most of the ethanol that is currently used in places like the U.S. and Brazil that use a blend of this in their gasoline is actually produced using corn. Now, corn ethanol has a few drawbacks to it. It's actually one of the lesser efficient manners of creating ethanol. And we'll get to a more efficient manner in a little bit. But before we move on, I actually want to just share some really cool information about the corn. You know, I mean, I think people overlook the fact that corn is awesome. And corn is only like eaten as corn, like 2% of what's grown out there is actually eaten as corn, like up to 12% if you include like corn chips and stuff like that. But 2%, people. So all you people out there eating corn on the cob, that's only 2% of all the corn that's grown in the U.S. And that the rest of it, it's not all fuel.
No.
A lot of it goes to feed livestock and stuff like that. But it's interesting to note that it's not a primarily food stock.
Another interesting thing to note about all this corn is that our yields now are a lot better. In 2010, we're getting about 165 bushels of corn per acre.
Now, that's the reason for this increase since from the olden days where I have it written here that in 1960 it was only 40 bushels per acre. So it's increased by like 300% or more.
Yeah.
This is all, I mean, this is science at work to fix our foods. This is like crop rotation and better irrigation systems, better soil management. All this kind of stuff has actually managed to increase our yields on raw corn so that we can have things like ethanol-fueled cars.
Another thing to note is not just that our corn yields have increased to provide more fuel available. The byproducts of corn ethanol can still be used for animal feed, and they're not just discarded.
Right. So it's kind of like it's a better crop yield.
Yeah.
All around. Now, I want to be clear, though, that corn ethanol is not perfect. As I mentioned earlier, it's not the most efficient manner of getting ethanol fuel, but there's also severe downsides to trying to consider, like, we can't just switch every car in the world over to 100% ethanol consumption. There are logistic issues with that. For one thing, we just can't grow that much corn. We just can't, people. We got too many cars on the road right now.
There are a lot of cars out there.
But still, using it as a good supplement for existing fuel sources it not only increases the efficiency of existing fuel based on fossil fuel, but it also cuts down on emissions. It's basically like a good way to cut without making a drastic change.
Yeah.
But okay, now this is where things get really interesting, is science is making it even better. I want to talk to you a little bit about something that they call cellulosic ethanol. And actually, I didn't know a whole lot about this, so maybe I should hand this off to Heather. Tell me a little bit about what's the difference between standard ethanol, which is primarily from corn, and this cellulosic stuff.
The cellulosic stuff comes mainly from 4 different places. It comes from agricultural residues, like unused portions of food plants, the stalks and the leaves that we're not eating in our salad.
When we talk about corn, there would be like the husks and the stalks. That is usually just discarded, but can be used in this process.
That can be used. Wood residues from like lumber byproducts or forest cleaning, municipal paper waste.
Oh, so actually garbage.
Yeah.
That's great.
The paper garbage can be recycled into this type of thing. There's also, dedicated energy crops. So crops grown specifically for this kind of thing.
Now, I was reading a little bit about these dedicated energy crops because I didn't see how this was going to fix the problem of growing corn, but it actually turns out that the crops that are specifically grown for this purpose, not only do they grow in substandard soil that can't be used for corn, but they also have a smaller, I guess you'd call it a smaller carbon print than actual growing corn is. So they're even more efficient just from the plant standpoint. But that's not the only part of this either. When you get down to the cellular structure, the molecular, when you're talking about the chemistry of cellulosic ethanol, this is where the things get really interesting.
Now, a lot of these materials, they still have the sugars, but they're bound in other things. So they're a little more, like you said, they're a little harder to get to pull out the stuff that we could ferment that could run our engines.
Right.
You have to pull out water through hydrolysis using enzymes to break down the complex cellulose into simple sugars that we can ferment and distill and use in engines.
Now, at this time, that remains the primary stumbling block to using cellulosic ethanol, which, by the way, the only real reason that scientists are looking into this is because of, well, not the only reason, but one of the primary reasons is because the byproducts of other products can already be used to create this. Like we mentioned earlier, lumber byproducts and human waste, human paper waste. Sorry, I don't want to get that mixed up.
No.
But the problem with this is, just like you mentioned, the glucose that is eventually turned into ethanol is at its base form when it grows in the plant is bound to what they call lignin, which is a very tough, it's actually specifically evolved to resist being torn apart by chemical interactions and things like that. So it was actually made by nature to thwart us. And science is attempting to thwart nature in return.
Yes.
But I do want to point out that if we can manage, if scientists can manage to actually pull this off, the energy yield based on cellulosic ethanol is so high that it actually even puts ethanol production to shame by an order of magnitude that's a little bit mind-boggling. But when you compare it to fossil fuel usage, it's even more ridiculous. Some of the sources that I was reading as research for today's show actually say that this could start happening widespread as early as like 2013. I mean, science is really interested in launching into this area in a very big way in the very near future. So it's kind of exciting that we could see that potentially being a widespread fuel source for the cars that we drive every day. Even if at that point, again, it only remains a supplement to the fossil fuels that we already use. Yeah.
Now, the cellulosic process stuff is interesting because if you can learn how to break down more types of plants like this, you could use things like kudzu. From down in the south, it's a plant that's it just takes over everything, and it's
right. So why not use something that's already growing on everything?
Yeah. Or you could,
you go scrape your walls and get fuel for your car.
Go scrape your walls, or clean out green ponds and lakes that have just been taken over by algae. This kind of thing. So it's all these kind of plants that are an annoyance. Can we turn them into something that we can use that would be not a hindrance to us, but something that we could use to our advantage?
Now, on the same topic of using things that are a hindrance to us, let's talk about fuel made from fat. Actually, animal fats, oils, and things like that. Biofuels. Now, this is already something that I've heard a lot of people using. Actually, a lot of farm people use this, like leftover cooking grease and things like that. Can actually be used in many engines. Actually, a large portion of engines as is. You don't even have to modify them to a great extent to be able to use some of these fuels, generally called biodiesel. which are just made from, like I said, recycled animal fats, oils that
vegetable
are already...
oils, recycled greases, that kind of thing. Now, to be a little bit more accurate, blends of less than 20% biodiesel can be used in a straight diesel equipment with either no or only minor modifications.
Oh, so I got it wrong again. That's why you keep me on a science show. Comic relief. But, you know, the great thing about those engines is when you pour the biodiesel in, I hear the exhaust smells exactly like McDonald's French fries. And who doesn't love that smell, right?
Much rather have that driving down the highway.
Now, since we've already covered some of the chemistry on the ethanol and to a lesser extent the cellulosic ethanol, why don't we talk a little bit about what makes biodiesel actually work? If I understand correctly, since this is based on animal byproducts or fats and oils and things like that, there's no glucose contained within there. So you can't make ethanol out of bioproducts.
No.
So how does that exactly work? How does the chemistry actually work on that front?
Well, you have triglycerides, which are fats and oils, which are essentially acids bonded to types of alcohols. Now, triglycerides will react with alcohol. So you'll have 3 ethyl esters, what they call of fatty acids, and 4 glycerols.
And the glycerol is actually the form of alcohol that kind of takes the place of glucose when you're creating these fuel sources, correct?
Yeah. And then you can decompose it in the presence of water. Heat accelerates the process. And you can form monoglycerides, diglycerides, free fatty acids. And from there, you can take some of those byproducts and move forward to biodiesel.
All right, so far on this show, we've talked about alcohol. Who doesn't love alcohol? We've talked about French fries and the leftover oil fueling your car so that it smells like McDonald's. These are all great things. I think the next thing that comes up naturally is talking about natural gas. When you talk about the bioproduct of French fries. Maybe I shouldn't have gone there. Maybe
not there. That's okay.
But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about natural gas. Now, this is still a fossil fuel, so not a renewable fuel source, but it has a primary advantage in being much more efficient in driving your car than actually like the standard gasoline that we use today. And unlike ethanol and biodiesel, which require to be mixed with gasoline to work in cars, there are actually working cars on the road that use entirely nothing but natural gas.
Yeah, 11.4 million natural gas vehicles, at least back in 2009. Most of them in Pakistan, Argentina, Iran, Brazil, India.
Boy, Brazil's really on the ball with this natural alternative fuel sources and everything.
Oh, yeah. They went to a certain point and they said, that's it. We got to make a change.
Now, here in the U.S., we're not entirely behind. We've got a lot of public transportation, primarily buses. And I think the current estimate is around 110,000 buses on the road in the U.S. that use natural gas. But at this time, there's only one, I say again, one commercially available car that runs primarily on natural gas. This is the Honda Civic GX. And actually, I've never seen one on the road, so I don't know how commercially available they are, to be honest. But commercially available consumer vehicles are really common in these other, especially, again, in Brazil. I'm hearing that these things are very common in taxis. And not only that, but there's actually big movements to have existing brands of cars converted over to natural gas systems. And cars that can run on multiple fuel sources that are actually driven by like internal computers that can get the mixes just right as you're driving down the road. That is science at work, people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, those type of vehicles that can run on multiple fuel sources are generally called flex fuel vehicles.
Yeah.
I mean, the difference between a vehicle that runs on pure gasoline and a vehicle that runs on flex fuel is about $100 in parts difference, and that's it for a manufacturer to make. Yeah, it's really only certain specific pieces.
I could practically afford that on the money I get from this show, almost. Yeah. I mean, over several months.
Well, it's all about, certain tubes and parts and valves are compliant with various materials, and then you just want to compliant for all the different flex fuel components. But if you have that, then those $100 and changes to exchange those parts for them on the manufacturer side, then you have that. So, and as
I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a widespread practice in some of these other places where they not only manufacture the cars that already run on the flex fuels, but they have these conversion kits available so that, just like you said, it's rather cheap. So in these other countries, it's very common to find converted cars using flex fuels.
Yeah. The big 3 auto companies in the U.S. have, they've even said, hey, we're willing to commit to making, 50% of our new vehicles flex fuel vehicles.
Nice.
Or operate on biodiesel, by certain years.
So they're willing, but will we see it happen?
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned at the top of this episode, we're not going to get too much in the politics of all this stuff.
Yeah.
But even though I didn't want to actually talk about the politics, there is certain, you can't really ignore that when you're talking about the availability and use of alternative fuel sources. So right now there is kind of a maybe not a industry standard optimization, but there is a certain blend where everything kind of works out for the economic climate, for the political climate, and we're going to, based on the research that I did for this particular episode, by next year, it could even become much more standard within the U.S. itself to see these flex vehicles where everything is actually running on a blend of both fossil fuel sources and ethanol or even methanol, which we kind of glanced over earlier. I mean, methanol is still a valid form of alternative fuel to a certain extent. It's a little less efficient than ethanol sources, but there's more information in our show notes if you want to check out all that. I just chose to skip it. So, hold it against me if you want to bring it up on our forums over at Jupiter Colony.
Also in our show notes are some links to ethanol organizations such as ethanol.org, Ethanol Across America.
The Citizens for Energy Freedom, I see we have a link down there, and some more information about the Open Fuel Standard Act, which is really, if you found today's information interesting at any level, this is probably more required reading, just so you know more about the topics at hand. Now, also in our show notes, we have some links to things. Social media is a big thing. You can follow some of these movements on Twitter, and I think there's even a Facebook for a couple of these. And on the subject of Twitter, we haven't mentioned on this show before, but you can actually contact both Heather and myself on Twitter if you're interested in feeding us more information about particular news topics, or if you just want to see what we're up to on it. I do multiple shows here. Heather is involved in all sorts of other, specifically she seems to follow NASA a bunch on Twitter. I don't have any idea why. And so she retells a bunch of that stuff. It's fun to follow. But her Twitter, you can find her over at JB Marsbase over on Twitter, and you'll find links to these in our show notes as well. And you can also find me as JB Jeremy.
You can also find us at our email at SciByte@jupiterbroadcasting.com for show ideas or just leaving us a note or anything.
And of course, there's always Jupiter Colony as well. Now, I do want to mention that this particular topic we covered on this show was actually brought up by a listener. They had been watching our first 3 episodes and said, you guys are really great at the spacey stuff, but I want to see something a little more earthbound, a little more terrestrial. So how about some chemistry or biology or something like this? Fortunately, we were able to wrap our brains around this, and I hope you found all of this information fascinating, as I have. I'm actually really excited to see that the whole alternative fuel thing is coming to fruition in the very near future.
Oh, yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. Oh, and you know what? When we were starting research on the show, you might have noticed that we get a little carried away with our research on occasion. We had to cut ourselves off. Yeah. But I do want to mention that a future episode of SciByte is likely going to be covering more alternative fuel sources, including electric cars and other vehicles like that, probably solar power. Maybe we might even get talking about like wind energy and hydroelectricity. We're not even sure yet, but there's a ton of science out there, guys. Yeah. I mean, this show, science is a huge topic. There's a billion things to talk about, but if you have specific topics that you'd love to see Heather and I discuss on this show, I would recommend, get in touch with us on Twitter. Head over to our jupitercolony.com. We do now officially have a subforum there. Just look for the SciByte topic. Or you can just send us an email, as Heather mentioned, and I've forgotten on our previous episodes, SciByte@jupiterbroadcasting.com. So until next week's episode, everybody, we hope we haven't broken your brains with this topic, and we'll see you for another brain-breaking session next week on SciByte.